So we do know that cannabis is not a new plant. It goes back over 28 million years. Now, this plant, cannabis, split from another plant name you might be familiar with, hops. That's right, the plant that is used in the making of beer. You can buy hop seeds on Amazon to make your own craft beer. I can guarantee you can't buy hemp seeds for that purpose. According to John White of CNBS Journal, it's believed that marijuana originated in the steppes of Central Asia in the regions that are now Mongolia and southern Siberia. And the Chinese found great uses for it. They started using it for making paper. They started using it, the whole plant, not just for that. We know it was used to make rope. It was used in pottery. It was used as an edible item. We all know that there's hemp seeds in birdseed. It's actually one of humanity's oldest cultivated crops and has been cultivated for some 12,000 years. There's a film I'm going to show you later, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened to the history of cannabis in the Americas. The Spanish encouraged hemp farming in their South American colonies in the mid-1950s. Honestly, I like that word encouraged. It was more like they enslaved the people and made them grow it. The English did grow it in Jamestown, and in fact, they were legislated to do it because it was a very popular commercial crop. And it was grown along with tobacco. In the late 1700s, cannabis farming had taken root in Mexico, as well as Spanish colonies in the province of California. And here's the interesting thing. Although cannabis was unknown when it was first brought to the so-called New World, it became very well known, and the Mexicans realized, because of their experience with peyote and with magic mushrooms, that it could also be something that could be pleasurable. So they actually cultivated that part of the plant. In 1850, we can see that marijuana appeared in the United States Pharmacopoeia, which was an authority that set standards for alternative, or actually all prescriptions and over-the-counter medications. And at that time, marijuana was approved as a treatment for several diseases, including neuralgia, tetanus, typhus, cholera, rabies, dysentery, alcoholism, opiate addiction, and more. We know that Queen Victoria used cannabis to deal with menstrual cramps, but things changed slowly. Starting in 1910, an influx of immigrants came to the US border, hoping to escape the Mexican Revolution. It was a civil war that was resulting in high casualties on both sides of the war, and also of civilians. So they estimate that on each side of the Civil War, 1 million of the combatants died on each side, and 1 million civilians. They brought marijuana with them, and suddenly cannabis was viewed with suspicion by Americans. In a fight between whites and Mexicans in El Paso, Texas in 1914, the whites claimed the fight occurred because cannabis made Mexicans violent. Nobody asked what the Mexicans thought caused the war or the fight. In an article in the El Paso Herald from March 8th, 1815, its opinion was that, quote, "It's clear that prosperous nations are alcohol friendly and inferior nations consume cannabis," end quote. Despite that, cannabis use spread among Blacks and Mexicans who lived and worked together near the border states. And Mexicans were also at that point toiling in fields for planting, which is still a major part of what they do in the United States to this very day. It also found favor with jazz musicians. And then Henry S. Anslinger in 1930 became the first head of the narcotics division of the Prohibition Bureau. This was based on his success with alcohol prohibition, which was now winding down, and his brother-in-law connection, Mellon, who was one of the people who invented plastics, nylon to be exact. With alcohol prohibition winding down, the narcotics division was formed to deal with heroin. But Harry Anslinger wasn't satisfied with that. He was interested in cannabis. Despite evidence contrary to a study that he himself had commissioned, he tossed out the results and began a misinformation campaign. He would spread rumors about cannabis with no scientific basis that suited his political ambitions. Fake news is not new. It has a long history. William Randolph Hearst was one of Anslinger's very, very powerful friends. He was also a racist. He had newspapers all across North America, and he used them to fan racism against Blacks and Mexicans with sensational, made-up stories. Thus, fake cannabis stories were planted in newspapers all over America, and he sold a lot of papers. And most people believed what they read and heard. You may have heard of the term yellow journalism. The Oxford Dictionary defines it as journalism that is based upon sensationalism and crude exaggeration. And the example they provide in their definition is, quote, equating murder and dismemberment with smoking pot is the worst yellow journalism. But we know the fake news sells. Even today, it sells newspapers. It sells on social media. It's on televised programs. We have only to look at the lawsuits settled by Dominion Voting Systems, where they got almost $1 billion from Fox News that knowingly spread stories that there was false with their voting system, that the election was stolen, when they in fact knew that was not the case. So by 1937, with this massive campaign, cannabis was prohibited and prosecuting and jail sentencing began in earnest. What about in Canada? Did you know that cannabis was prohibited in 1923 in Canada? There was no debate. A single sentence from a health minister of the day was all it took. And we also can look at the writings that were occurring in Canada. You've perhaps heard of Emily Murphy. She was once featured on the $50 bill. She's a feminist icon of the famous five who fought for women's rights to be considered persons. In 1916, she was also the first female magistrate in Canada, indeed in the British Empire at that time. But she was also a racist, and she was also a proponent of eugenics. She linked the Negro menace to cannabis use. She claimed that a ring of immigrants from other countries, particularly China, would corrupt the white race by getting Canadians hooked on drugs. In her book, The Black Candle, monikered under her pseudonym, Janie Canuck, she wrote, "It is hardly credible that the average Chinese peddler has any definite idea in his mind of bringing about the downfall of the white race." ... As a judge in Alberta, her support contributed to the passage of Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act in 1928, an act that led to the forced sterilization of people considered mentally deficient, and a large number of them were Indigenous women. And that act was not repealed till 1972. But the public, having read newspaper stories and heard people talking about reefer madness and how it drove people insane, were further moved by a movie. And I'm going to show you just a clip of the movie that became so infamous with this time period.
Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
Of course, if you're afraid.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide. and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
We can laugh when we look at this today, but what's really amazing is that this is what people really thought could happen. They believed this, believed it with all their heart. So you can imagine that this prohibition spread all over the place. And worse, it didn't settle for just the Americas. Anslinger got his way in 1937, and they started arresting people. But in fact, the US also wanted to spread this worldwide. And again, Harry Anslinger was involved in that. The United Nations was trying to develop a single drug policy worldwide in 1961. They wanted to prohibit, not just prohibit cannabis, but classify it with drugs such as heroin and synthetic opiates in the most restricted categories. And this was added. So this war against cannabis and growing cannabis, which didn't differentiate between the one that was hallucinogenic, or at least for fun or recreational, versus the one that was simply for making rope. And at the same time, let's think about this. This is the time when plastics started to grow. So the rope that was hemp rope became plastic rope. And plastic rope in the ocean doesn't degrade, but hemp rope did. So we'll come back to that as well later. So the legality of cannabis for medical, for recreational purposes, distribution, possession, cultivation, was severely affected worldwide. And it's only now that it's been descheduled in 2020 that some of these regulations that made it prohibited are breaking down. The use of cannabis for recreational purposes is still prohibited in many countries, and some have adopted decriminalization. And we have to applaud Canada because we were one of the first countries in the world to make recreational cannabis legal. But we have not decriminalized it in Canada. And that affects 500,000 people. That's not even talking about the amount of money that was spent and the huge political efforts to keep on prohibiting cannabis. And the injustice of the stigma is those who have criminal records for small amounts of the herb. This misuse of legislation led to cannabis. Misuse of legislation, we recognize that cannabis should not have gone through this sort of a background. Even Bill Blair, who's now liberal and was a Toronto police chief, had explained that one of the reasons they legalized it was this. One of the great injustices in this country is this disparity and disproportionality of the enforcement of these laws and the impact it has had on minority communities, as particularly Aboriginal communities and those in our most vulnerable neighborhoods. And when the Toronto Star looked at evidence for 10 years of Toronto police data, they found that Black people with no criminal record were 3 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than white people with no prior charges. Well, the government has made some argument that, they really can't go ahead and decriminalize it. They have given a reason, and you can look on the government website and see that it says expungement is intended for extraordinary circumstances where the criminalization of an activity was historically unjust, such as where a law violated the charter. But this was not the case for convictions for simple possession of cannabis. Record suspensions are an appropriate recourse. So what does that mean? We all hear, well, you can get a pardon. You can get a pardon. Let me see. A pardon. Do you know what you have to do to get a pardon in Canada? I'm going to read it to you. For starters, the applicant is told their paperwork must include original documents with original signatures and original office seals or stamps from the court. Duplicates of the forms will be tossed back at you. You must get your fingerprints taken and wait to receive your criminal record. If you have more than one, you need proof of each one from the court that heard your case and/or the police service that arrested you. You need to ensure you have proof of conviction that includes the date and court where you were sentenced, the offense that led to your conviction, your sentence, and the arresting police force. You must obtain local police records for the city or town where you live currently and everywhere you've lived for the past 5 years. Now, if your criminal record or local police check doesn't clearly show that you were convicted only of simple possession of cannabis and that your fine was only a fine or victim surcharge, you must obtain your court information and include proof of payment if there is a restitution order. You must contact the court that heard your case, or in each case, if you were sentenced in more than one court. Make sure each court fills in the proper sections. Include all your convictions from that court. Sign, date the forms. Include official seals or stamps. Moving along, you must now fill the Parole Board of Canada questionnaire, both sides, don't forget. Include a photocopy of your identification and fire it off in an envelope to Ottawa. If you served in the military, another step may await you. Now, for anyone who's probably been convicted under these circumstances, can you think of any reason why anyone would want to go back and get fingerprinted and have to relive the horrors of that time? You know, CAMH says that there are estimated 500,000 Canadians with cannabis possession convictions. We're asking for expungement. Why? Why can't it simply be that the government go back, look at the records, and expunge them? They did exactly that for thousands of convictions that were against the LGBTQS community regarding their sexual orientation. They not only expunged them, but they apologized. And we do have proof that some of these arrests were historically unjust. Perhaps you have heard of carding, racial profiling. Did you know that the Supreme Court of Canada heard such a case on October the 25th? This case involved one Joseph Christopher Luamba versus the Attorney General of Quebec and the Attorney General of Canada, the Civil Liberties Association and Canadian Association of Black Lawyers were the interveners. The attorneys were the defendants. Racial profiling occurs on a systemic level when an unjustifiable level of scrutiny and differential treatment becomes ingrained in an organization's culture and operations. Anti-Black racism impacts Black Canadians at every step of the criminal justice system, from policing to pretrial detention to sentencing to prisons. And we know that we have the data to find that Canadian police stop, search, and question Black Canadians at higher rates than other racial groups. This surveillance has meant that more people are likely to be arrested and charged with criminal offenses compared to people of other groups, and seriously injured and or killed during encounters with the police. The Supreme Court issued a landmark decision finding that police roadside interceptions are often based on appearances and prejudices associated with skin color rather than on road safety objectives, and that legislation and the common law rule for allowing such arbitrary detention can no longer stand. What do you think this has to do with higher cannabis possession charges, jail time, a century, etc.? As we look at the war on drugs, although we tend to think of it as an American thing, I can assure you it's very much a Canadian thing as well, because everything that the Americans do, we have been in lockstep with them. So now I'm going to show you another video, and this one is about the war on drugs.
I have the next video ready.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
He lied.
In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
50 years later, the real public enemy number one is clear. It's not the drugs or the people who use them. The real enemy is the drug war itself and the policies and systems that feed it. Nixon's own aide admitted the drug war was never really about drugs. The war on drugs is a tool for racial and social control and criminalization, surveillance, and punishment. Black and white people use and sell drugs at a similar rate. Yet Black communities have been targeted and vilified, making up 26% of drug arrests, but just 13% of the US population. The drug war affects us all. The US has the highest incarceration rate in the world, in large part because of the drug war. Of the over 2 million people currently incarcerated, 1 in 5 are locked up for a drug offense. Because of the drug war, our drug supply is unknown and risky, with overdose rates at an all-time high. Because of the drug war, we are not safe. Not in our cars, not in our offices, not even in our beds. It is time to end the drug war. The step we must take right now is to decriminalize all drugs, no longer arresting people for what they put in their bodies or carry with them, no longer choosing punishment over support. Decriminalization means a person struggling with their use is given access to treatment, not years behind bars. Decriminalization means a parent can focus on their child's wellness without the criminal justice system getting in the way. Decriminalization means a city can finally invest in health services and support instead of police and jails. We know a different reality is possible. We envision a world after the drug war, a world where someone's relationship to drugs isn't an excuse to take away the autonomy, justice, and safety every person deserves. After the drug war, stigma and fear will no longer rule our communities. Compassion and collective care will take their place. We deserve the world after the drug war, and we need to build that vision together. Join us in the fight for decriminalization and beyond.
So when you look at that and you think about this war on drugs and what it's meant, it's tragic what has happened. But then I think to myself, where do Unitarians stand in this issue? Did we have a point of view at all on this? And it was surprising to find out that we did. And I found out that they had in July 1st, 1970, the Unitarian Universalist Association of America had a resolution called the Legalization of Marijuana 1970. And here's what it stated in part. Whereas the present local, state, or provincial and federal laws in the United States and Canada regarding the growing, sale, trade, possession, and consumption of cannabis sativa are based largely on public hysteria and myth rather than on any established data about the effects of marijuana on the user, and whereas the present laws are making criminals of and causing undue and unjust punishment to many persons who have no criminal intent in the use of the drugs, and where the laws relating to marijuana are not uniform or uniformly enforced and are being used as political weapons against these people, especially the young who dissent in politics or lifestyle from the accepted norms of the two countries, they said, be it resolved that the 1970 General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association urges that all local, state, or provincial and federal laws in the United States and Canada make the growing, sale, trade, and possession of marijuana a criminal offense. Be immediately repealed. We know it wasn't repealed, but the UUA repeated resolutions in 2012, and they had a workshop in 2017 called Cannabis Prohibition. We as a congregation, we have a role here. One of our things, perhaps, that we need to write and submit a resolution to the Canadian Unitarian Council to address meaningful amnesty to clear old criminal records and funnel the gains of legal cannabis into harmed communities, include those people in the legal cannabis community that were harmed by this prohibition. Because of these criminal records, they can't even apply for jobs in the industry. And the other thing that's very disturbing is what's happened in terms of the legalization of cannabis. We see that according to statista.com, that cannabis was a $7 billion business in Canada in 2022, and it's expected to expand to 4 times that by the time 2026 rolls around. So we should be very concerned about who's running the legal cannabis business. And the shocking thing is that it's mostly white men, almost no women, few Black people, few Indigenous people. And when we were doing the legislation in Canada about cannabis to decriminalize it, there was no listening to Indigenous voices at that time. They did not consult Indigenous people. This is an ongoing issue as well. I would hope that as part of our action that we could do something in terms of joining the movement of groups such as Cannabis Amnesty. And I have 2 more. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? You'll notice I'm wearing a hat right now. It's a Tilly hat. I want you to know that it's made from cannabis. It's a hemp material. So this can be done. The future can be very bright, but we have to address the damage that was done to those during the so-called war on drugs. We have to address what it did to communities, what it did to individuals, and we need to clear their records. I have one last film that I want to show you, and this is from Cannabis Amnesty, and it's about what happens. I don't want to say anything more about it. You can see it for yourself.
Morning.
Oh my god, Emma brought this weed last night and it was so citrusy and minty. Like, it was so great.
Morning. Michael Emery, here for the interview.
Fill out this secondary form and come back when we call your name.
All right. Thank you.
Fill out this secondary form and we'll call you.
Hey, bro, do you have an extra pen I could use? I didn't really get home last night, so I didn't really bring one.
Yeah. I have one. That's here somewhere. Just give me 1 second.
Did you complete the online pre-screen prior to your arrival?
Yeah, it's okay. I'm just gonna ask up there. Don't even worry about it.
Sorry about that, man.
Nah, what you need to do, bro, is when you get that new job, get some new shoes.
Bro, they're opening another dispensary across the street. How many do we need? All Toronto is just condo, dispensary.
Weapons on you. No, yourself or myself.
You got this, son. Stop thinking too much. When they hear you speaking your one-of-a-kind mind, they'll never be able to turn you down. You got this.
Michael!
Now go on. They're calling you.
You're under arrest for possession of marijuana.
I got this.
that little piece of film really hits me here because there's too much truth in it. We, the member congregations of the Canadian Unitarian Council, covenant to affirm and promote. Number 8, individual and communal action that accountably dismantles racism and systemic barriers to full inclusion in ourselves and our institutions. This seems like a small part of the battle, but it is indeed part of the battle, is to get justice for people that didn't experience that and were suffered and did suffer under racism and systemic barriers. I hope that you will join me this fall when we start to look at this as a resolution and make a step to make things right. I'm very proud to be a Unitarian and involved in this. Thank you. This concludes my talk for today.